Oh, okay, my name is Craig Cessford and I work for the Cambridge Archaeological Unit, who are part of the Department of Archaeology at the university. And we do what's known as developer-funded archaeology. The talk you had this morning from Graham Barker, that's about research academic archaeology, where, I mean, essentially the difference is Graham picks what sites he wants to dig on and goes and digs there. I and the people I work with dig in advance of development, so we don't choose the sites, but the developer pays for what we're supposed to be doing. So this has been the site system in Britain. It developed over time, but really it's about 1990 they started going, so it's quite well established. It's been going for over 20 years, and essentially archaeology is part of the planning process. So when a firm or whoever decides they want to undertake a development of some kind, it goes to the local council and they decide many things about archaeology, nature, various other constraints. And sometimes they say, you should do some archaeology in advance of the development. So in the case of the site I'm going to talk about, this was St John's College in Cambridge, one of the many colleges in Cambridge, who basically wanted to develop the Divinity School. If anyone knows Cambridge, this is basically just across the street from the fancy gate entrance into St John's. It's this Victorian building on the site, which is quite nice looking, which the college has owned for several decades, but it was a Victorian building that was starting to show its age, and they decided to redevelop it. And as one of the things that they wanted to do in part of the redevelopment was to dig out the basement and create cellars under the building for storage space and ancillary functions and toilets and things like that. So they thought this would be a good idea. The existing building only had a few basements, so we knew that most of it had archaeology under there. And so they put in the planning proposal and they were told, fine, you're going to have to do an excavation. They came to us and we said, what do we have to do? And we said, this is going to be tricky inside a building. There were lots of logistical factors. And we told them roughly what we thought might be there, but we couldn't tell them exactly because unlike lots of archaeology, if archaeology takes place in a field, then you can just go and dig some trenches in advance and see what's going on. If archaeology is within a standing building that people are still using, you can't go in and rip up all their floorboards and destroy their building in advance. So we told them this is part of medieval Cambridge. We know there was a hospital nearby. There may be some burials. And they went, oh, do you think there'll be many? And we said, well, depends, somewhere between 50 and 600. And they said, oh, that sounds a bit bad, but they still went ahead with the development. And essentially the reason why the cemetery is here that I'm talking about is because the predecessor of St John's College, which was founded, the college itself was founded in 1511, but it was founded by basically taking over a charitable hospital that had been there since about 1190, 1200 AD. So it'd been there for about 300 years. That's actually where St John's College is. But across the street, they had their cemetery. And we knew about this, we knew about it from documents, but we didn't know quite where it was, what it was like or anything like that. So essentially, you've got this hospital, which develops over time, but is essentially a charitable institution. It's not, a medieval hospital is not like a modern hospital in terms of medical care. This is more about social care, looking after people who have long-term conditions or who are very poor or elderly, people who can't take care of themselves, in medieval terms at least. So we went in 2010 to 2011 and we took up the floors, and there was some later archaeology underneath the floors. There were some buildings and things like that, so we took those off first, and then we came down, and essentially what we found were skeletons everywhere inside the building where there were surviving deposits. We found skeletons. And not only that, but over the 300 years that this hospital cemetery had been in use, basically they'd buried one set of people covering the entirety of the cemetery, and then they'd gone back and started again and buried the people slightly shallower, so that they didn't, sometimes they truncated the earlier skeletons and took parts of them away, but most times they left them in situ and just put people above them. So essentially over 300 years, you had about 6 to 8 levels of skeletons, one above each other, which is how you can end up with 400 skeletons within a single building. So we undertook these excavations, and the thing about medieval burials is that they're mostly very similar. Most people are buried as an extended inhumation, lying on their back with the head to the west in an extended position, probably in shrouds largely, and they don't have grave goods. So essentially everyone looks the same. So we carried on and we did various bits of post-excavation analysis, and in 2015, about 4 years after the excavation, we published a report in an archaeological journal about the skeletons, and at that point we were discussing what to do with them. So if you want to dig human remains in Britain, you need a license from the Ministry of Justice that gives you permission to deal with them. So during the excavation, we got this license, and obviously there aren't really big ethical issues about most of what we do when we're excavating, in the sense that as a developer-funded archaeologist, we're largely going to what we're going to dig up is going to be destroyed if we don't lift it. So it's good that we dig it up, but then there's the question of what happens afterwards, and that's an issue in terms of the license, the Ministry of Justice, but also the authorities at the county council who sort of control these things. And the options are long-term storage, so it's available for future academic study, or reburial, or various other things. And we decided to try and do some more academic work on it, and under the auspices of Dr. John Robb of the Department of Archaeology, he put together this thing which we called the After the Plague Project, Health and History in Medieval Cambridge. And we went to the Wellcome Trust and we got some money to do various other bits and pieces of work, quite a lot of analysis, additional analysis on the skeletons. So this work started off as developer-funded archaeology and then became more research archaeology. The two fields should really mesh, and although we don't control what we dig, we do try and contribute to research and agendas and things like that. So that went on to 2021, or actually lingered a bit into 2022 because of COVID. It's now theoretically over, although as with all these projects, publication and various other things will take a few more years to run their press. So the question is, what can we learn from these skeletons? Well, some of these are exactly the same as the things Graham talked about this morning. So we do the archaeology in terms of the excavation. There's documentary studies, which don't apply to Neanderthals really. Osteoarchaeology, paleopathology, radiocarbon dates, stable isotopes, ancient DNA, and geometric morphometrics. So, I mean, this is just what we did. There are other things. There is no way to completely exhaust what you could possibly do. So the archaeological aspect, which is what I started off by running and what my involvement from the project really comes from, is really about the precise recording of context and the recovery of material, understanding exactly where it comes from, trying to work out how it was deposited, the sequence of events that happened on the site. And the sequence of events in this site is quite complicated in the sense that you have 400 burials. You also have other features associated with the cemetery. We had various paths and other things. But then we had this whole phase of later occupation when there were buildings on top of the site. And we had earlier structures and archaeology. So, I mean, the site had clearly been used for about 200 years before the cemetery was established as just domestic occupation. And there was actually some Roman archaeology underneath all of that. So that's really the initial stage. It's about getting as much information about the site as you can during the excavation. Then, this being a medieval site, there are lots of surviving documentary sources, and these are very rich and informative, and there have been several books published, but there are issues in terms of the medieval documents are just silent on some issues. That medieval people wrote down things for specific reasons, and some things they just never wrote about. Other things tend not to survive. So even if they were recorded at the time, we have no information. So, but we are cognizant of all this extra information. Osteoarchaeology, that's when you study the bones, you measure them, you look at them, and you can tell quite a lot about a skeleton from the bones with greater or lesser degrees of certainty. You can tell things about their sex, their age at death, their stature, and we did all of that. Then We looked at paleopathology, that's anything that's gone wrong, that's any sign of disease on the bone or any sign of trauma where you've had breaks or anything. This is, again, very informative, although, as I'm constantly reminded by my colleagues, it's quite limited in the sense that probably 90% of things that happen don't actually impact the skeleton, they just impact the soft tissue. So there are lots of things we're not so sure about, although there are new methods that are coming through to deal with that. So, for example, one thing we did was a big study on cancer in the past, trying to look at the prevalence of various forms of cancer before tobacco consumption and before the Industrial Revolution. And that required lots and lots of scanning and various things to try and work out this, just to get a long-term understanding of how cancer affects the population, how much of what we suffer from today is effectively self-inflicted because of the modern world and how much is just inherent in human beings almost. You can also study stable isotopes. These are basically things that you absorb into your body during life in different proportions, in different things, and they, by looking at you literally are what you eat in some respects. And some of these are linked to diet or location. So some of the things relate to how much fish or how much meat you eat. Some of them relate to the geology and things like that over where you were born or grew up. Because a lot of this is to do with teeth, in the sense that your bones keep on changing throughout life, but your teeth are essentially formed at whatever stage during childhood or the teenage years, and they sort of save that value. They don't change afterwards. So as a rule of thumb, people's bones relate to the last few years before they die, whereas people's teeth relate to their childhood. So you can use them for different things, and we do this. This, for example, is strontium isotopes. Essentially, these are very strongly affected by the geology that you spend your childhood on. You absorb them through these, and we look at the ratios of two different stable isotopes. You look at strontium-87 and strontium-86. It's a slightly annoying technique in the sense that it's very easy to tell where people didn't come from. So we can say that some people that we studied, most people we studied, fit with the local pattern, and we just assume that they're local. We can tell that other people can't have grown up locally, but then you have to try and say, well, where do we think they come from? And the annoying thing is that various places in continental Europe that they might have come from have the same values, so you can't actually distinguish them. So it's good for telling you where people didn't come from, less good at telling you where they did come from. Although at least it lets you identify them as non-locals. We also look at radiocarbon dating. Again, that's based on stable isotopes, which decay over time. The ones that we use to look at diet and things like that, they don't decay over time, so they're the same as they were when someone died. These are ones that decay over time, and that allows you to tell how long it's been since they died. We also look at ancient DNA. So this is one of the major things of archaeology, certainly of the last decade, that essentially we can extract aDNA from bones, from teeth, and try to look at the human DNA. We do that both for the person that we're sampling, but also it can tell you about a lot of other things. It can tell you about pathogens. So if you look at your teeth, if you look at the DNA from someone's teeth, because you have blood vessels circulating through them, if you suffer from a disease and there's lots of stuff from that disease in your bloodstream, then we will pick up some of that. And the classic example is plague that we look at, but there are lots of other ones as well. In fact, yeah, DNA, I mean, the main problem with DNA is that 90% of what they find isn't human, which is, they spent a lot of time trying to screen that out before they realized that actually there was some important information in there as well. So we look at ancient DNA, and this tells you things about like ancestry and where people come from. So in terms of ancient DNA, the main thing at the moment is still comparing people to modern populations. Which modern populations do your results best map onto? Are you most closely related to modern British people, modern Norwegian people, modern French people, whatever? That's still largely what we do. But as we do more and more ancient DNA on archaeological samples from the past, then you can do more and more comparing them to within those past groups, which is much better, because that's what we really want to know about. Because say I have a medieval person from 1300 AD and we would compare them to modern populations. The problem is the modern populations may have changed since 1300 AD, almost certainly have. So your comparisons are slightly dodgy. So the big thing over, say, the next decade will be that ancient DNA will move towards being more comparisons between older DNA from older populations. Another thing you can do with ancient DNA, there's just lots of information in there, and you know that the amount that they can now extract and get out of DNA is amazing. It sort of feels that what they can do sort of doubles every year almost in terms of processing power and comparison. And one thing as archaeologists we were quite keen on this project was to look at things like eye color and hair color and skin color, just because it's interesting to know these things about the people in the past. I mean, there's a slight reticence. Some people tend to think this is a bit frivolous, that, you know, it's not very serious, whereas, you know, I agree it's not terribly serious, but I think in terms of connecting us with people in the past, it's actually very interesting. The other thing is it's dangerous. The minute you come up with any statement and gets out into the internet, someone will misrepresent whatever you're saying. So the minute you start talking about skin color in particular, but also eye and hair color, you have to be very careful, and you probably have to switch your phone and computer off for a week after they make the press announcement. Geometric morphometrics, that's basically where you take lots and lots of scans of the structure of the bone and see what it looks like. And that's largely because all the activity you do in life will affect the physical structure of your bone. It will strengthen it or weaken it, and it will shift and twist slightly how it grows depending on exactly what kinds of activities you take. So it's a slightly crude tool in the sense that it will give you a composite picture of what happened over someone's life, but it will tell you about what kind of things they did to a degree. So what can we learn from skeletons? I mean, the thing to stress is that the hospital burials are quite anonymous. We don't have any named individuals in the documents. We don't have any really clear statements of who was buried there, although we know more about who was actually excluded. And the archaeology is also quite anonymous in the sense that the burial rite was quite uniform and repetitive. So what we're really trying to do is to move away from the anonymity of the skeletons. And you can do this at various scales, the scales of the individual, the cemetery, the hospital, the town, the rural hinterland, medieval England, and all of space and time sort of. So we'll sort of move out in this. So this is one individual at the skeleton that we dug at the cemetery, F958, as it's prosaically known. And we can learn a lot about this individual. You know, we can learn that he's a man from both osteology and the ancient DNA. The osteology tells us that he died somewhere between the ages of 45 and 60. And we can date when he died through radiocarbon dating to 1221 to 89. This is quite complicated and involves lots of modeling, but that's what we might. Then obviously by taking the age that he died at and subtracting it and subtracting how long they lived, you can work out when they were born. We can say things about his stature, that he suffered from bad teeth and gout by studying paleopathology. Again, from paleopathology, you can tell he had no major injuries, but he had lots of minor traumas. Looking at stable isotopes suggests he's of local origin, or at least his stable isotopes are compatible with him being local. There are actually other places in England where you could produce exactly the same results. So you can't prove someone is local, but the default assumption is if they look local, then you assume they are. We also have evidence for an enriched diet. He ate quite a lot of meat and probably fish. And we can tell what his maternal DNA group was and things like that. So you can build up quite a big picture about just one individual. Then moving out, you can compare him to all the other people that were buried in the same cemetery. So just for an example, this is the stable isotopes. which measure his carbon and his nitrogen, and you can see the sort of spread of results we got from everyone from the hospital that we tested, and you can see the red star where he is. So obviously he's actually at the high end of the spectrum in terms of stable isotopes. So this suggests that compared to the other people buried in the cemetery, he ate more, probably more fit, definitely more meat and probably more fish than was average for the people buried there. We then move out again and we look at other cemeteries. One of the very good things about working in Cambridge is that we have, over time, a parish cemetery was excavated in the 1970s. The Cambridge Archaeological Unit more recently excavated people from a friary in 2016 and 2017. So you can compare between these different sites. So again, we compare them to the hospital, the urban parish, and the friary, and you can see he actually has high values compared to all these people. What's interesting is the hospital seems to have a much wider range of values than anywhere else. We started off worrying that the hospital population would be actually very biased and unrepresentative of Cambridge, just a small section of the small, poorer people in society, when in fact they seem to cover almost all of society, at least compared to the other burial grounds we've managed to find. Obviously, some of the people from the friary had similar levels to this individual, but both the urban parish and the friary didn't match anybody with the lower values from the hospital. So we do seem to be getting poor people in the hospital that aren't found anywhere else. You then move out again. So there is a rural parish at Cherry Hinton near Cambridge, which was excavated in the late 1990s. And you can see that by comparing this, all their results are sort of down and to the left-hand side, which is basically low values. So the people in the rural parish are eating less fish and less meat than people in the town, although they are overlapping with some of the people in the hospital. So you have that comparison. Zooming out again, you go to massive comparisons of however many thousand people from medieval England have been looked at for stable isotopes over the past 20 years. And you see quite how they fit into that. And you can see that our individual sort of is at the upper range of the main cluster, but not one of these weird outlier people who had clearly had some very specific dietary thing going on. And this is one of the very good things about stable isotopes. You know, because they're all measured in the same way and all calculated in the same way, over time you're sort of part of this big cumulative project, and so our results that we generate for our research, you know, hopefully in 20 years' time, when there are 100 times as many values for medieval England, we will still be getting used to form the basis for plots like this. And then finally, we go beyond that to we looked at a massive range of burials throughout time. So we actually sampled skeletons all the way from the early Neolithic, about 6000 BC, right way through to the Victorian period in the 1830s, and looked at just how diet has changed over time, and very, very big picture stuff, which does show that diet has changed significantly between the various periods, not necessarily in a sort of linear progression towards more meat and more fish, say, or in other ways, but that you can distinguish the periods. So one question that was really important to us is who was buried in the hospital. And burial in a town like medieval Cambridge is actually quite complicated, in the sense that there are about 30 places you can get buried. And who gets buried where depends on various factors, things like what parish you belong to, whether you're a friar or a religious professional, whether you're Jewish. And we spent a lot of time, or I spent a lot of time, trying to work this out, at least as far as you can. And then we looked at our actual sample, because none of our samples in archaeology are ever perfect. We don't have everyone, but more importantly, we don't ever have a representative sample. We have the sites we've managed to dig, but it would be very, very foolish to try and assume that those were absolutely representative of the population in the past. So we tried hard to work out how biased our population was going to be and in what ways it was likely to be biased. And then you try and allow for these in your conclusions and discussions, that you say, yes, we have these results, but actually, essentially we end up weighting people in terms of we're overrepresented with this kind of person, but underrepresented with this kind of person. So when you want to work out average and mean values, you give different individuals and different samples different weights. So this involves a lot of complex data analysis, which I didn't do and I don't understand. Essentially, you get dozens, if not hundreds of variables for each individual, and then you do lots and lots of statistics. And what you're looking for are basically lots and lots of how much do things correlate with other things. And this is just a graphic way of trying to show this. Some things seem to be quite strongly correlated with each other, that if you have one thing, you're very likely to have another. Other things seem to have very little correlation at all. So we do lots and lots of statistical analysis. And what this does is allow us to break down the population that we excavated into various groups, people who fit together into clusters analytically, and you test whether these clusters are statistically significant and whether they seem to be genuine. And we got various clusters that seem to make sense, or at least are statistically valid. You then have to interpret them, which is a different question. So we found that by studying the arms of people, we found a group of people, mainly at the hospital, who had relatively weak arms and quite symmetrical arms. This is actually quite unusual. Most people in the past have very asymmetrical arms, because this is largely formed in your sort of late teen years, early 20 years. And if you're doing any sort of reasonable degree of physical labor, one of your arms that you favor, be it left or right, will become much stronger than the others. We found that most of our population fitted with this, but we had this group of weird people that had relatively weak and quite symmetrical arms. And our assumption about these is, this being Cambridge, these are the scholars who do know some of them are buried at or have connections with the hospital, because in their late teenage, early teen years, they are effectively not usually picking up anything heavier than a book. They're not out laboring in the fields. They're not learning a trade. Well, they are learning a trade, but it's the trade of academia, which tends not to develop strong arm bones. Obviously, this is pre-rowing at Cambridge, so they weren't all out on the river and doing physical exercise. So we found this group, and they were mainly defined by these geometric morphometrics of having these relatively weak asymmetrical arms, but that does correlate with various other things. It does correlate with things like diet. They were having a better diet than other people in general, and various things. So the position we've got to now is that we think we can actually identify several distinct groups at the hospital, and those allow us to place roughly half the skeletons into one group or another. You'll see that the biggest group is still other, the green one, the anonymous blob, which is, to be honest, what you often end up with a lot of archaeological analysis, even when you've tried your hardest. There's a lot of people that don't group and that are left out of your discussions, but you do your best. So some people seem to just are young individuals who just seem to be very poor and chronically ill. Then you've got people who are old and poor. Then you've got the group that we think, then you've got people who seem to have a very good life, but then maybe fall into poverty very late in life. You've got this group that I've discussed that are scholars. Then some people seem to be travelers. Those are people whose strontium isotope suggests they're not local, and the hospital would have, if you're sort of traveling and you die, there's no municipal cemetery in Cambridge at the time. There is no generic cemetery that anyone can get buried in. Most people have a parish they can get buried in, but one of the places you could get buried as a traveler would be in the hospital. So the result of all this analysis is that we have managed to define these groups and work out various people that we think were buried in this hospital cemetery. Of course, they're not individuals yet. They're not still don't know their names, but we know a lot more about them. We also find some interesting things. So there is basically, all the hospital tells us about who can go in there is that it's basically for looking after the poor and infirm, which is a fairly generic term. But they do say that various groups are excluded. That includes various groups like pregnant women, and our excavations did show there were no pregnant women or very young children buried in the cemetery. But another group that was supposed to be excluded, were people suffering from Hansen's disease, or what was known as leprosy at the time. And obviously, part of the ancient DNA testing we did was trying to compare these things for Hansen's disease. And we actually found a case in the hospital and got very excited until I was told that it was a very non-advanced case, so this person probably wouldn't have actually visibly shown it. So although we do know that someone with leprosy was in the hospital, they were presumably admitted because people at the time couldn't see. So essentially, by looking at this excavation all came about because St John's College wanted to have basements in its building. It wanted to increase its storage capacity, various things like that. I'm not sure after we excavated 400 skeletons, they thought it was such a good idea after all, but by the time we started digging, they were sort of committed. So they've had to live with it, despite it taking a bit longer and costing a little bit more than they'd hoped. And these are a very good group in their own right, but the thing about developer-funded archaeology is it's very much a cumulative project that, we build on lots of other work in Cambridge, both other cemeteries and elsewhere. We build on other work in England in terms of archaeology. So it's, it's very richly textured in that way. It's very much a cumulative process. And although it is not research orientated in the sense of we don't get to pick the sites, and often we don't really know exactly what we're going to find in advance. So we often try and come up with what we call research aims in advance. And my experience is that 90% of them don't last 5 days on site before you've discovered that the interesting things on site are things you're unaware of, and some of the things you were hoping for aren't there entirely. So you usually end up making a completely different set of research aims after the project, but we do fit into the research world of academia quite nicely. And it's, in Britain at least, this probably constitutes well over 95% of the archaeological research and archaeological investigation that goes on. Because it's developer funded, it doesn't come from government, it doesn't come from research bodies, it doesn't come from charitable trusts. It's just a completely different funding stream that, which comes from the world of commerce, which is just basically much larger than the streams of academic funding. And it is sort of a major employer in archaeology. I think the numbers are something like 6,000 or 7,000 people employed directly in developer-funded archaeological fieldwork these days, most of whom have a degree, most of whom, site I'm on at the moment has several Cambridge people who've graduated from Cambridge, some of whom are interested in making it a long-term career, some of whom are waiting for their PhD funding to come through, some of whom are waiting to discover what the rest they want to do with the rest of their lives, but they're having an introduction to developer-funded archaeology. And I think that's my 40 minutes, so I'll round it up there.
Great. Thanks, Craig. Do you want to just stop sharing your screen for a second?
Yeah.
Thank you. So a couple of questions that come in that I'll deal with straight away. You talked about within the burial, and I think just to clarify a little bit, people want to know, was there a range of genders as well? So you talked about sort of a range of different types of people, but was there a mixture of genders as well?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so there was a range of, well, archaeologically we should really talk about sex rather than gender, because looking at the bones and the DNA is an issue of sex, right? And the relationship to gender is a arguable one that academics spend a lot of time discussing. Yes, we found both men and women in the burial ground, and we found a whole mixture of ranges. Apart from, we didn't find anyone under the age of about 7, and there were very few children up to about the age of 14, which is sort of the point where you become considered an adult in the medieval period. So there were a few older children, but not many. But we found both men and women. We found slightly more men than women, but that's standard for Cambridge. We don't have exact figures, but because of the presence of the university and various other things, the gender split in late medieval Cambridge is probably 60-40 in favour of men anywhere, just in the town population as a whole.
And would that be different to a medieval hospital in a town without a university? Potentially,
yes. I mean, these comparisons get very difficult because hospitals are all different institutions in the medieval period. They all have to fulfill different roles. So you get different kinds of hospitals who do different things, and then there's a whole issue about how no one has ever excavated an entire hospital and had all their burials. But yes, there have been other ones where the sex ratio is much more equal. There have been other hospitals where they found quite a lot of very young children, so they were clearly in those ones. I mean, one thing we're not sure about is, we excavated this cemetery, but across the street at St. John's in their first court is where the buildings of the hospital and the chapel was there. So actually there would be quite a lot of burials under the lawn there, mainly of the religious staff of the hospital and people like that. So we know that we don't actually have a full representation of the hospital. And one of the big things about almost all archaeology is that all your samples are always biased, and it's trying to understand those biases.
Someone's asked as well, do we know why the Victorian builders didn't disturb the graves?
The answer is they did. So technically, at the time, it was a legal offence to disturb burials without reporting them, but somehow they managed to. So if you imagine the building, you've got the foundations of that building being dug down, and those were going through skeletons, and they were just digging them away. But the bits in between those external and internal wall foundations were just left in place. This is pre a lot of mechanization. All the wall foundation trenches in the Victorian period are hand dug, so they're just quite narrow trenches for the actual foundation. So the Victorians probably removed about 10 to 15% of the archaeology, including the skeletons, from the site. And as far as we can tell, they kept a discrete pile of all the human bones somewhere, and then put them back. If you dig your trench and then build your wall, you've got a bit of space at the side. So they then put the human remains back in the space in the beside the walls. So we found almost as much in quantity of human remains in Victorian deposits as we did in medieval ones. Unfortunately, those have all become completely disarticulated and unassociated. So we don't know which skull goes with which femur or what. But we have hundreds of individuals from those deposits, of which, in theory, you could do a lot, but actually, it's slightly. When we already have 400 medieval burials, it's better to concentrate on those than to deal with the disarticulated.
Of course, I am slightly disturbed to know that Victorian builders just used bones as backfill. That's a slightly disturbing image in my mind.
Yeah, it's also slightly unlikely that St. John's College authorities weren't aware of this at the time.
Okay.
we know they were making regular visits to the site, and it's just across the road. So.
Sure. Yeah, they would have noticed. Yeah.
I mean, there were. This is the point in time when this is done in, I think, the 1880s, and there are already local antiquaries in Cambridge. So one of them, we have records of other human remains being disturbed and spotted at this time, and that seems to have gone reasonably okay. I think the problem at the hospital is probably that they found far too many and got scared. It's one thing to be a builder in the Victorian period and come across 2 or 3 burials. Then you can let your antiquary look at them and deal with them. But when you're finding hundreds, and especially, when they found a skeleton, they didn't dig the entire skeleton. They basically chopped through whatever they needed for the wall foundation. So we have bottom halves of bodies, we have top halves of bodies, and the rest is just missing.
And well, that leads, Ruben asks, helpfully, under what circumstances could a modern development be stopped on archaeological grounds?
So there are some sites that you can't get development permission for. So some sites are already scheduled. If we know they're very important, they've already got legal protection, and you just know you can't build there, so you won't put a planning application. So there's that level of protection. So, you know, no one is putting houses on Stonehenge kind of thing. Beyond that, then you have various stages to the process. So it didn't apply in this case because we couldn't get in on a standing builder, but usually you would do an evaluation first, where you'd go with the machine and dig trenches and look at about 2% of the site and see what's there. And in some cases, you find something that actually causes you to decide not to develop the site, or to change slightly what you're developing, so that you move everything to one side of the field where there's no archaeology and ignore the rest. That's more of a financial decision usually from the developer. And when it gets much further on in the process, if you don't find something during the evaluation, but do find something during the excavation, it's much more difficult to stop things, because at that point whoever was cancelling it would probably have to pay some level of compensation, at which point neither the local council nor the national government is terribly keen to stop a development and pay hundreds of thousands of pounds to a developer to do this.
Oh, Graham, you've raised your hand, Graham. Do you want to chip in?
Just saying, it's been quite interesting, you know, being a fellow at St John's, seeing it from both sides, because obviously as an archaeologist, you know, we're really keen, I mean, to see the work done. As Craig said, I think the college was, in that sense, was quite taken aback by how much it's cost, because it is part, you know, it was a feature of planning permission. We wouldn't get planning permission unless we'd taken the archaeology into consideration. So, for example, there's the college is now contemplating planning building extra accommodation for graduates just north of the college, in some land that it's got. And it's got, I think there are 5 big houses on it, all of which in a terrible state, 19th century. And so the plan is broadly to I mean, they're still got to get planning permission, but they're negotiating with them. It'll be better to knock those houses down, apart from the facade of one, and then rebuild graduate accommodation. But you know, it's many millions of pounds is the overall budget, and as part of that, they've in their heads they're putting in the college is putting a considerable amount of money for the archaeology, because it's known. I mean, Craig will know the site well. It is known that, you know, Roman, Anglo-Saxon, the area is part of old Cambridge. There's bound to be a lot of archaeology to do as part of planning permission. So that's, you know, it's an expensive process, but it clearly needs to be done. I mean, the planning process is such. The principle is if you've got, if we were just going to put a car park there, in a sense, we could get planning permission, because the principle is if things are preserved, it's fine, and if they're preserved under a car park, it's absolutely fine. It's the fact that the modern, will need excavations, which will therefore disturb, and therefore there's got to be the archaeology. It's kind of it's managing it, recording it. It's records, written, photographic, and whatever records for something that is destroyed. Excavation is a destructive process.
Yeah, interesting. I was just trying to think. In another world, I was a property developer, so I know this well. I know. Certainly, to agree with Craig, it's hard. It's very hard once you've committed X amount of pounds to a project to suddenly be like, sorry, no, you can't do it anymore. Then government doesn't really want to cough up the compensation for it. So it's very interesting.
Charles, just add to that, Cambridge, of course, everybody is completely geared up to the fact it's a historic town with loads of archaeology everywhere. So the colleges, the town council, the builders, the developers, everybody is aware. Whereas, I mean, there have been other northern industrial towns where sometimes things were assumed not to be there, and then there were things. I mean, Sheffield, for example, some things were found to do with the beginnings of its steel industry that were slightly not bargained for, and there the development was stopped. What an English Heritage had to say, look, this should have, it was a miscalculation. It hadn't been seen, and things were paid so it could be restored. I mean, protected and so on. So when it works well, and broadly, I mean, the strange thing in Britain is we probably have the weakest antiquities laws anywhere in the world, apart from in some of the United States, where broadly the archaeology under the ground belongs to the landowner. It's, as Craig says, scheduled, whereas in virtually all other countries, it belongs to the state. But the difference is, in many of the countries that I've worked in, there's ferocious antiquities law to say it belongs to the state. And therefore, if you're a landowner, a peasant farmer, you're desperate that you don't find anything, or you get rid of it as quickly as possible. Whereas in Britain, it broadly, it works by consensus, and it works pretty well. This whole relationship between giving planning permission and securing up. I mean, there are problems with it, but broadly, it works a lot better than in many countries.
Yeah, I mean, my experience is that, especially because the system's now been running for over 20 years, so most businesses are actually aware of what's going on. It works relatively well. The big issue we still have with archaeology is that compared to most other parts of the building process, it's very unpredictable how much we're going to find and deal with, and how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take. And that's really the thing that the building industry still dislikes most about archaeology. It's the fact that I can't tell them it will take them 6 weeks to do something. I have to tell them it will take them 6 people somewhere between 4 weeks and 10 weeks to do it. And they just don't like that.
Dare I ask, how long did you tell St. John's it was going to take to do the archaeology there?
I think, see, there it got very complicated because,
or perhaps great. Well, if you need to,
I think we'd told them it would take anything between, I think, 10 and 20 weeks. But then when we'd done that, it turned out that for logistical reasons, we couldn't actually dig everything at the same time. So we had to dig it sort of 1 or 2 rooms at a time and they had to be installing props and things to make sure walls didn't fall down. And so we ended up technically taking a lot longer because we hadn't been told we couldn't do this. We pretty much kept a schedule. The thing we did have, because in this case, the number was so unpredictable, we had additional time and additional money per extra number of skeletons we found, just because they do take longer and they do cost more money than other kinds of archaeology. So we did keep to schedule and we did keep to budget. It's just from the outset, those 2 things were designed with a lot of flexibility in them.
Yeah. So Charlie asks, were all the different types of people, so you've got the poor and the elderly and the scholars, was it like a random distribution, or were they grouped together in certain pockets in the burial?
The distribution is largely the distribution in that sense is random. Essentially, it seems to be that they bury people in order, so that you basically have rows, and whoever dies next gets buried in the next grave. So there are no family plots, there are no group plots. It's just one burial ground for everyone, and you don't get to pick and choose. So even if you had some relatives or something who'd been buried there, you wouldn't be able to ask to be buried, which is quite unlike, say, a medieval parish cemetery where we do find evidence that people would be grouped together. So this was effectively it'd been randomized by date of death.
Okay. And then someone asks, do either of you have any recommended reading on ancient DNA?
So ancient DNA is it's such a rapidly evolving field that and that sort of, I think the people who do this as specialists don't feel it's worth writing anything, because it'll almost be outdated by the time it's published, and it's all very much about individual studies. I think there's a book by David Reich, which I can't remember the title of, who's one of the sort of most established figures in the field, and I think he's done an overview thing, which is probably one of the best places to start.
Okay.
So the same. I mean, at the beginning of the whole revolution, a colleague at Cambridge, Martin Jones, who was the Pitt Rivers Professor for Archaeological Science, wrote a book on a big British initiative which funded a lot of work on the beginning of ancient DNA. Martin Jones, MK Jones, I can't remember what it's called, but it was you know, a popular overview, but but the thing is, as Craig said, it's just advancing so fast, what people can do and the questions they can ask. Yeah, David Reich is R-E-I-C-H, David Reich. He's the one who's collaborated a lot with Svante Pääbo, and Svante Pääbo is the person who got the Nobel Prize this year, because he pioneered getting ancient DNA out, in fact, of Neanderthals. But David Reich is, that's right, yeah, who we are and how we got here, yeah. The Reich, I mean, you know, and there's been more and more impressive work like that. Look, in a way, the beginnings of ancient DNA, people were very engaged in, I don't know, big questions about migration, and slightly to the, not the despair of archaeologists, but you know, headlines were grabbed with fancy scientific papers about movement of people. I mean, like the Out of Africa thing I was talking about. But in a way, there have been some terrific collaborations between David Reich and some British archaeologists in more recent years, where they've looked in real detail, in a sense, at the questions that really do interest us, in terms of things like family relationships in Neolithic societies, where they've kind of drilled down into social processes. Because as archaeologists, I mean, when was the earliest something is quite an interesting question, but really, whether, you know, as you've seen from me and from Craig, whether we're looking at people 75,000 years ago or 11th, 12th, 13th century, whatever, we're interested in behavior, in people and behavior.
Yeah.
A lot of the focused on all this migration, and there are really important insights from that. It shows how there have been all sorts of population replacement, big events in British prehistory. And there have been some interesting debates early on in ancient DNA, saying how the ancient DNA people really needed to collaborate better with archaeologists, because again, it wasn't sort of politics free, because some of the populist right-wing governments of Eastern Europe were looking at some of the findings and kind of reading all sorts of things about migrations and deep origins of, you know, Hungarian peoples and so on and so forth. So politics, there were some major archaeological papers addressing the kind of early work, saying, look, you know, we've got to be really cautious about the kind of language that's used in these early papers. It might make great headlines in a fancy journal like Nature, but it needs a more reflection. And we've moved into that second stage now. David Reich would probably be one of the first to say yes, and he's been part of that group from moving from one kind to another with really effective collaborations.
Lola asked Craig, or I suppose a question for both of you really was, you know, you've done lots of quite interesting scientific lab-based analysis of the skeletons and the project. Is that used on every project, or does it vary between project to project? And obviously it depends on what, I assume, you literally find once you've removed the topsoil, I guess, as well, to an extent.
Yeah, I mean, the work that we do is very project specific and varies on how much, on what we find. So, you know, to be very simple, let's think about it. Lots of our sites have no human remains, so we don't do any of these things about human remains on them. But then with human remains, it depends slightly on the quality of what you find. So, especially because I'm doing developer funded work, sometimes we dig a very small portion of a cemetery, say, and you get a very small sample from it. I mean, the classic example would be, we do lots of little bits of work in parish churchyards because they're putting in a toilet block or a disabled access ramp or something like that. And we find a few skeletons, but not enough to be a good sample of that site. So at that point, you probably don't want to expend a lot of resources and do a lot of scientific analysis on it. We've done more scientific stuff on the after the plague sites and on the hospital cemetery because we managed to get involved with an academic project. So a lot of it's about funding. There are endless things you could do, and you can never do quite all of them on a particular site. And it also depends. I mean, so we did stable isotope analysis after the 2010 excavations because that was quite a well-established technique that people were aware about. I asked about DNA at the time, and basically it was impossible and impractical and couldn't happen. And then 6 years later, by the time we were talking about this academic project, it had become completely possible and practical. So these things are not quite standard on every project yet, but they're becoming more standard on sites where we find a decent skeletal sample. So it's definitely, it's standard now that you would do radiocarbon dating. It's become standard that you do stable isotopes. We're not quite at the point where ancient DNA is standard yet, but I think we will move. We're also partly relying on people actually offering this services. Sometimes these services effectively move almost completely into the commercial world, that, you know, for radiocarbon dating, that is now effectively a commercial service most of the time, where you just find a lab and send them a sample and they charge you money and they'll do that. Stable isotopes is sort of getting that way, although it's not quite there yet. Whereas I don't think we've reached that point of DNA. We're sort of waiting for someone to set up a commercial DNA lab that you can just send your samples into. So at the moment, you have to actually attract somehow an academic group doing ancient DNA to work with you on a research project. You can't just say, I have 10 skeletons, I've taken the samples, how much will it cost to do the ancient DNA?
And
but,
sorry.
Maybe in 5 years we'll get to that point, although I think the big thing about ancient DNA is actually probably the analysis, the work of the sample and processing it has actually become very simple. The bit that is much more complicated is actually you have to compare your results to try and find out what they mean. And it's that bit of analysis that's actually much more, where you need much more specialist knowledge and is quite different.
Like I say, you know, we chose to do these two talks about what can archaeologists learn from bones, human bones, about the living. But as Craig said, I mean, there's huge amounts of other kinds of archaeology where bones don't feature. And I mean, we've got that spectacular waterlogged Bronze Age village outside Cambridge, Must Farm, that the unit's been involved with. You know, wonderful archaeology about settlement. I remember seeing the footprints of cattle in the mud and the feet of the child that was with the cattle. So there's that kind. And at the other end, I remember hearing Craig give a terrific talk once about, he was studying from all these excavations around Cambridge, what had happened to all the cups and saucers that the colleges throw out at different times and who got them and you know, and so on. It was tracking, you know, where corpus plate went and who got it and what, you know, what they did and so on. So there's, you know, it's a very, very broad church of that humanities at one end and the sharpest end of science at the other. So I'm publishing this summer. It's a big field report, you know, lots of people contributing. It's called In the Footsteps of the Etruscans, which is the publication of where I, with a group of students, walked in every ploughed field within 10 kilometers of a little town in outside Rome. And it tracks prehistoric, pre-Roman, Etruscan, Roman, medieval, post-medieval settlement changes through time. Hardly any excavation, almost entirely picking pots up from the plough soil, environmental work. And I've worked on things like the impact of people on rainforest. I've worked on what we can learn in desert areas about when people did things to deserts from which they recovered and when they didn't recover. So we've got a whole range of work with science and humanities approaches to material culture, to environmental climate proxies to animal bones, plant remains, evidence of food, and so on. So we've given you a particular kind of taste with human bones studies, just to give you some sense of what's common and what's different about these studies. But archaeology is a very, very broad church of the kind of approaches.
And why it's and ultimately, Graham, as you've both been saying, it's why it's so interesting. Like that's at
Yeah,
the core why it's interesting.
Yeah, and obviously we don't know who the people, the backgrounds of the people who are listening to this, but I do think there's an element of difference and bravery. There isn't an archaeology A level. Students find their way to the subject in different pathways. They find from different backgrounds, and we're expecting that on our side as interviewing for Cambridge Places. It's a different track from, I'm doing geography, I want to do geography. I'm doing physics, I want to do physics. I'm doing history, I want to do history. And that's great trajectories. But inevitably, the archaeological community, or the kind of students who want to do the subject, it's a different kind of subject. And there's a place, if you get attracted to the science or attracted to the statistics, great. And if you want to run a mile from them, great, there's a place for you. Which
Great.
I'm in the anti-statistics category, but I work an awful lot with science.
Yeah.
I mean, say in many respects, I'm sort of soft science is what I do, but I move across. I mean, most of what I'm doing is working with colleagues in different areas of the sciences.
Well, I mean, we've overrun, but I would say one of the nice things about archaeology compared to, I'm a historian by trade. There's a lot of collaboration in archaeology. And in a way that in history you do tend to be ploughing quite a lonely furrow in your archive often.
It's a team. It's a team subject par excellence. And coming back to the earlier conversation about joining the college and whether Eleanor was feeling it on her own and so on. Certainly, I think the archaeological cohort, the college is obviously incredibly important, but as she said, the numbers are such that they all know each other. And indeed, we've seen, there's the second year marching around fields in Germany today. So I think it's very much a community, and I felt that as soon as I joined the subject from classics, I did feel part of a discipline, which has carried me ever since. And I think that's something that the students get gripped by it too, because you're so much brought into the face of it, because you're so involved in the fieldwork with us. It's a very different kind of relationship from, we have the supervisions, we have the lectures, and so on, but it's a different kind of relationship with your fellow students and a different kind of relationship with the people teaching you because of this engagement in field and lab and classroom.
Well, I think that's an apt point to stop. Thank you very much. On behalf of everyone who's watching, I say thank you very much to Craig, and thank you very much for Graham for interesting talks and answering questions, and also talking to me because I'm interested in it as well. So that's great. So I will say thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see some of you apply come October. Have a good day.